So you wake up one cold, dark morning, bleary-eyed and hungry, and force yourself to roll out of bed. Walk downstairs into the desolate wasteland that serves as your troll cave and masturbation station, and immediately boot up your computer to find that Total War Warhammer 40k has been announced. Drop pods fall in steel rain from the sky. Grav tanks blast lances of eldritch energy across the battlefield, and the churning grind of the Chaos War Machine pulps all that stand in its way. The trailer is here, and as predicted, the Space Marines with the Blood Angels and Ultramarines, the Craft World Eldari, the Green Tide, and the Forces of Chaos under Abaddon the Despoiler are launching as starting factions. The dream is real. This is the way. So for part 2 of this 40k series, how to implement the grim darkness of the 41st millennium in a trilogy of Total War games, we're talking the battle system. No Total War game is complete without battles. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that they are the most important element of this series, straight up. There are lots of strategy games with an overarching campaign map, many that are much more in-depth and nuanced than what we've seen from Creative Assembly over the last 20 years, but none that combine the campaign map with real-time, cinematic battles to the same degree that Total War has done. And that's what makes this union of 40k and Total War so appealing. What has made the Warhammer trilogy such a resounding success? That unique combination of gorgeous visuals, satisfying visceral and cinematic combat, all bound and inextricably linked to a grand campaign that gives those battles context. Plain and simple, that is what makes this series special. And I've said many times before, but it bears repeating, changing elements of how combat functions in terms of cover, or weaponry, or technology does not prevent 40k from being a Total War game. If you've not watched our previous videos on this subject, please go watch them first. They do a good job of laying the foundations for what we will discuss today and should answer a lot of your questions and concerns. So, as the title would suggest, this video is all about the battles themselves, how they would function, what they would look like, and what would need to change in comparison to previous games to bring Warhammer 40,000 to life. I am joined by Italian Spartacus, a veteran of the Long War, a man steeped in the ritual, cult, lore, and tabletop rules of this beloved franchise, and he is going to hit you with some knowledge before we plunge into the meat and potatoes of this video. Spartacus, take it away, my dude.
So just as Indy was saying, we're going to focus entirely on the battle system for this video. And as this series continues, we'll explore the campaign map and other important elements of the theoretical trilogy, but that's not here, that is not now. Today, we're going to focus on the battle map. What that might look like as far as the terrain goes, the unit sizes, individual deployments, individual units, and what have you. We'll be exploring how a siege might operate across a Total War 40k planet or system. But the fun doesn't really end there. There are so many features, rules, and character skills that are jammed into the tabletop game that would make a strong translation to a video game format. So we'll also be talking about special deployment rules like deep strikes and drop pods. Another core tenet of at least 8th edition Warhammer 40,000 has been command points and stratagems. That entire system plays a heavy hand in some battle mechanics and siege warfare that we have in mind as well. To get it started, let's take a look at conflicts in Warhammer 40,000 on a macro level. I know we keep saying it, but it's worth repeating. This would be unlike any other Total War before. So there would absolutely need to be big changes, not just the typical formula, but the game's engine as well. Because when you're looking at a conflict in the 41st millennium, you're not looking at verdant hills or skaven-blighted warrens, dwarf-infested drinking houses, or the snowy tundras of Norska. Nay, you're looking at entire cityscapes that have been completely blown to hell. Massive gothic citadels, abandoned space hulks floating silently in the void, and the twisting defensive structures of the Eldar. So when you come zooming into the battle map of Warhammer 40,000, you're looking at a much different landscape. Even if we don't look at the lore behind those battlegrounds and we take a look explicitly at the tabletop battlefield, you see a lot more obstruction across the map than you would in a Warhammer fantasy game. Large hab blocks, ruined buildings, trench systems, hills, all sorts of ways to block line of sight from the enemy. And this is going to be a massive factor for the battle system that we have in mind. So a real quick disclaimer though, we're working under the assumption that we'd have the limitations of a modified Total War Rome 2 engine, which is what Total War Warhammer is based off of. With these limitations in mind, it will color our discussion about individual mechanics, but Indy and I both believe that these need to be, or that there needs to be, an entirely new engine to make Total War 40k work, which means that the features we're expecting to see are somewhat limited, but by what we know Creative Assembly can do. But rest assured, if they decide to tackle this series, there's going to be a lot of stuff we've never seen before. And that's one of the important points to realize. This isn't going to look exactly like any Total War game that's come before. We've already said that. And I think one other little disclaimer I want to talk about too before I hand things over to Indy Pride to discuss the battle map is the importance of melee combat. So when you take a look at Total War Warhammer, there's a heavy emphasis on melee combat. When you take a look at Rome or Shogun or Medieval, there's a heavy emphasis on melee combat. Yeah, sure, range combat is definitely a factor with archers, cannons, so on and so forth, depending on which arena we're taking a look at. But it is a huge focus, especially of 40k. But when you look at other eras, like I know a lot of people have said, oh, I want to see a Total War Warhammer, or Total War World War I, or a Total War World War II. There is less melee focus in those games and more pure ranged focus. So I think that 40k has such a strong translation to the current Total War formula of having a very persistent and strong and obviously evident melee combat system built into its sci-fi universe. And I think that that makes for a good just one-to-one translation into a Total War 40,000. So with all that in mind, that kind of high level of Warhammer 40,000, a good overview of what we're going to cover in this video, I think it's time to dive on in. We'll have Indy Pride talk about the battle maps.
And I think Italian's already touched on it pretty well. This would obviously be a huge departure from content we've seen in the past. There are elements of warfare that would come to the fore like never before. The importance of ranged combat, of cover, and how squad-based units actually utilize it. Urban environments and how they break up the flow of your bog-standard, typical Total War battlefield. But for every mechanic or feature that would need drastic overhauls and dramatic changes to make it all work, there's just as much that's already been established that would carry over perfectly. UI, unit models, the winds of magic, bombardments, campaign framework, how single entities function, list goes on and on and on. But I think before we jump into the cover system, urban warfare, and battle maps themselves, we need to talk about unit selection and the factions. And just like Warhammer Fantasy, one of the biggest strengths 40k has as a setting is in its variety, in its asymmetry, where no two races look or play the same. And I think for the most part, Creative Assembly have done an admirable job bringing that element to life for the old world and beyond. And it would have to be a focal point for the Imperium, Eldari, Green Tide, and Chaos as well. And that's just talking about Game 1. So to frame this discussion, we need to make a distinction between true to tabletop and true to lore. In the lore, yeah, a single Space Marine can take on dozens or hundreds of enemies given the right situation. They are a force of nature, but on the tabletop, they can be killed by a single unlucky burst of lasgun fire. So there's a balance to be struck there between accurately reflecting the lore while still functioning in a way that fighting them is fun and satisfying overall. The Imperial Guard, Greenskins, and Tyranids, for example, are known for just swarming the field in a tide of bodies. Pain is temporary. Honor is forever, and by God, we shall drown them in the blood of our fallen. So these are your swarm-style races, fielding large numbers of troops per regiment. 160 to 200 models per unit on the baseline troops. Guardsmen, Orc Boys, Ormagons, Termagants, and Chaos Cultists. Space Marines and Heretic Astartes would have an entirely different style, with a much heavier emphasis on squad-based combat. Much smaller armies and smaller unit sizes, rolling in kill teams of maybe 15 to 20 models per unit. So you might be looking at a 150 to a 300 model army for Space Marines against 2,000 to 3,000 for the Imperial Guard or NIDS, which, yes, I understand does not perfectly reflect the lore. 150 Space Marines could easily bring a planet to its knees, but there's that middle ground that needs to be reached. Can't retain the ratios we hear about in the lore and still keep it a fun and viable game. Now I will say, one of the counter arguments I frequently see is when people say, but there are millions of Imperial Guard on some planets. There are trillions of Imperial citizens. Scale is just way too big for any of this to possibly work, which doesn't really make any sense to me. You understand how Total War works, right? Like how video games work? Like we've never had a Total War game with 200,000 soldiers on the field, like at the Battle of Waterloo, and yet Napoleon Total War still did a great job of bringing the Napoleonic era of warfare to life. We've never had a Total War game that joined 20,000 Crusaders with 35,000 Muslims at the Horns of Hattin, and yet Medieval 2 is one of the most beloved strategy games of all time. The scale doesn't have to match up one-to-one. The features don't have to be a perfect translation from the lore to make it work in video game form. Dawn of War has what, like 100 dudes on screen at once, tops? Even Ultimate Apocalypse doesn't even come close to the size of a full-scale Total War battle. Were those not entertaining portrayals of the 40k universe? I certainly felt like they were. Are you honestly trying to tell me that a series that frequently has 2,000 to 5,000 warriors and single entities on screen at once wouldn't be by far the best depiction of warfare we've ever had in a 40k strategy game? It doesn't have to be a perfect depiction of the lore in every single facet and minutia. Sacrifices can and do get made in every video game ever to make them viable and doable, as long as it treats the source material with respect and remains faithful to the source material every way that it can. It is all gravy. So the argument that this isn't doable because the scale won't be perfect is small-minded to me. In this case, not blessed is the mind too small for doubt. You mustn't be afraid to dream a little bigger, darling. I think that's probably the biggest thing here, is that you've got to reframe your perspective a bit. It can be difficult to imagine something when it's never been done before, but just because something hasn't been done in Total War in the past doesn't mean it won't come in the future. Now, with that aside, out of the way, let's talk gameplay and mechanics. There's some truly devastating weaponry in this setting. Plasma weapons that can detonate a truck-sized crater in the midst of enemy formations, turning everything to glass. Tanks that can blast through 10-foot layers of rockcrete and still go strong with all their penetrating power. Power claws that can rip an armored alien in two, and when Italian delves into it a bit later in this video, we'll be talking stratagems that allow you to summon orbital bombardments and strafing runs from dropships, pounding an enemy position with devastating artillery from on high. Abilities quite similar to the spells and globals we've already seen in Total War Warhammer. The blueprint for a lot of that stuff is already there for the taking, so right off the bat, I think battle speed and combat resolution is going to be a large priority. We don't want a situation where you load in, and as soon as deployment is finished, armies are completely decimating each other from across the map. Might be fun at first, might be some nice eye candy there, but that is a recipe for 2-minute long battles where you leave everything on fire at will and laugh. Go AFK and go jerk yourself off in the corner. Doesn't matter. Not very satisfying or tactical in the long run. We don't want the capacity to just point and click enemy armies out of existence right from the word go, causing mass routes right at the start. Hit chance, accuracy, damage output, health pools, and cover all need to be tuned to a point where there is plenty of time to maneuver and outthink your opponent, whether they be human or AI. And when I mention something like an orbital bombardment from on high, we're talking Dawn of War style, a hyper-focused beam that can take out a tank or demolish a single blobbed up regiment, not some Armageddon-style glassing of an entire planet. Maybe if you want to go Doom Rocket-style Scryer shenanigans in campaign, if it's gated appropriately behind tech and progression and some kind of variable that prevents you from just spamming it, that'll work out okay. But for the basic orbital, nah, not something that can just completely destroy an enemy army outright. And this means army losses needs to be reworked too. I am tired of seeing armies break from the field when there's exciting combat still to be had, when elite units with amazing morale are making their last stand, and then all of a sudden they abandon all training and all discipline and run because the balance bar told them to. Because the morale penalty from army losses is so severe, that threshold needs to be lowered, so we can get back to enjoying battles for the spectacle they should be. Now, yeah, that does not mean some shitty squad of rookie guardsmen should hold the line like the mighty Terminator heroes of the Horus Heresy. I just mean the army losses penalty right now kicks in too early for all factions, and it has a negative impact on my enjoyment of combat, and it can and does occasionally ruin battles, which brings me to the battlefield itself. For a long time, one of the things that's really bothered me about Total War games is that their battle maps are really goddamn boring. I mean, take a look at what we've seen since Rome 2. Just game after game of rolling hills, fields, and trees, almost completely devoid of interesting terrain, landmarks, buildings, or opportunities for asymmetrical gameplay. You can change the skin of the map all you want with weather or a different biome, but at the end of the day, players notice when maps all feel the same and there's no impetus to draw combat towards objectives or strong points, and this problem plagues Total War Warhammer just as much, if not more so, than it does historical. Sure, it's got some great eye candy in the background, but none of it is playable. This is going to have to change in 40k for a multitude of reasons, but as we've already stated, a heavy emphasis on ranged combat, cover, the Z-axis, and urban environments are going to be the biggest. For this next section, there are 2 rule sets from the tabletop that provide a really nice framework for how urban warfare might look like, how cover might function, how ranged combat would be affected in these types of environments. Cities of Death and Urban Conquest, where in the nightmare future, armies battle each other to annihilation amidst the ruins of civilization, with every building housing the potential to become a bastion of resistance or an unmarked grave. Urban warfare completely changes the complexion of the battlefield, where even lightning-quick Drukhari raiders find their speed hampered in the choke points and alleyways of bombed-out rubble, where no flank is ever safe and mobility takes on a whole new meaning. Now, I don't expect to see an Imperial Hive City equivalent of Times Square, New York on your average battle map. I don't think we'll be looking at urban combat anywhere near that dense, because as soon as you start talking about squads or regiments moving from building to building to building to building in a sprawling urban scenario where the whole map is just made up of city, that element doesn't work so well for TW. But buildings and cover are going to play an important role. I think what we'd be looking at on a normal battle map is the reintroduction of terrain as an important battlefield feature. Go figure. Terrain, pretty important in a game that's based on cover, with buildings that can be garrisoned by your rank and file troops. These buildings wouldn't cover the whole gameplay space or even necessarily a large percentage of it, but a warehouse here, a blown out bank there, a skyscraper in the middle of the map, these give you strong points to fight over that grant tactical advantages if you take them and put the right units into the right situation. Buildings would have HP bars just like any other wall or tower from a siege map in the past, and if your troops still happen to be standing in it once it falls, after taking some shots from a Lehman Russ or a las cannon, they take damage or they die, depending on the unit type. Now, capture points are nothing new in Total War. We had garrison buildings all the way back in Napoleon. Dojos were introduced in Shogun 2 as yet another win condition that forced players to make moves and actually play the objective, and I think these extra dynamics fit perfectly in a cover-based RTS. Which brings us to cover, the big game changer that will influence everything from the layout of battle maps to how units interact with other units and the terrain itself. So I'm dropping the gauntlet right meow. Gone are the days of featureless battlefields, those Rome 2 rolling hills and fields, those boring grassy plains and rolling hills where terrain had no impact whatsoever. We need cliffs, we need poison lakes and rivers of acid, we need waterfalls, natural barriers of fallen trees and ravines and trenches the troops can interact with and take cover behind. From the very outset of the Horus Heresy, we see how important terrain and cover are to the 40k style of warfare. Hordes of Dark Mechanicum acolytes hauling 1 million metric tons of black sand at the Urgal Depression on Istvan V, the infamous drop site massacre, forming a vast network of earthworks, trenches, bunkers, and redoubts. This isn't the Revolutionary War, where formations of redcoats just stand in the open, waiting to get shot in the face, although it does actually happen more than you might think, but each map needs cover that infantry can hide behind, consistent with the biome or planet where the two armies clashed. So I'm talking stuff like rubble, buildings, burnt out tanks, scorched bunkers. These kind of assets are essential if you want to bring a 40k battlefield to life and bring death to the soldiers on it. From a gameplay perspective, the effect they have should be very clear, and I think Dawn of War is a great series to draw inspiration from on that front. There's a very logical cover system in place there, with light cover providing, say, a 15% reduction or missile block chance from incoming fire, medium cover a 25% missile block chance, and heavy cover a 50% block chance. But finding momentary reprieve behind the safety of a fence or a wall won't be the be-all end-all of ranged warfare in 40k. Lots of weapons in this setting are explicitly designed to ignore cover. Executioner rounds fired by Vanguard Eliminators are sophisticated self-guiding missiles that can seek their target behind cover, even changing direction mid-flight with tiny bursts of ballistic propellant. The Gauss weaponry of the Necrons can almost entirely ignore cover blasting through all material like a wet paper towel. There are even entire factions like the Imperial Fist chapter, whose tactics allow them to ignore or reduce an enemy's cover save. Not to mention, we've got airstrikes and orbital bombardments and other stratagems that will be extremely proficient at forcing opponents out of cover or demolishing them should they stay entrenched. I don't think we'll ever be looking at Battlefield Bad Company Frostbite engine destruction, but there are certain weapon types that should have a noticeable effect when you're in cover. And if you're garrisoning a building with, say, 200 guardsmen, you best not still be standing around when a Riptide or a Fire Prism turns up the heat. And verticality, that Z-axis, will also play a prominent role. You've seen shades of that in Warhammer Fantasy with dragons and other flyers, but I think any fighter jet style aircraft that requires momentum to move is out of the picture as a battlefield unit in 40k, but could still be in the game as a strafing run type spell, lined up exactly how we'd line up a Wind of Death or Sea Shanty Broadside from the Vampire Coast DLC. Just add in the guttural bark of its weaponry, the scream of its engines as it flies overhead, and the shadow as it passes over, and you're pretty good to go. But any hovercraft style unit is potentially in the realm of viability, a unit type we could actually see in armies in a 40k Total War. But that vertical axis, that Z-axis, isn't just about hovercraft or bombing runs. It could also impact your shooting, giving your troops greater range, greater AP, and a larger reduction to enemy cover saves when you are above your enemy. So building maps that are conducive towards that kind of play, those kind of tactics, with abandoned guard towers and overhanging cliffs and real elevation, could play a large role, an important role, if CA decides to go that route. But I want to take a moment here and shift gears. Italian and myself have been talking a lot about units in 40k, how they function on the tabletop and the lore, and how weaponry informs their role on the battlefield. And I think there are two schools of thought, two ways of handling this particular issue of gear and weaponry. On the one hand, for the longest time really, we've had weapon variants form their own distinct unit. So for example, Lothern Seaguard come with a shield or unshielded, two separate units. Same thing with War Dancers. They can come with Azrai Spears or in a dual sword variant. Same thing with Chosen. Chosen Great Weapons, Chosen Halberds, or Chosen Sword and Board. You get the picture. In 40k, that would mean TAC Marines with rocket launchers, their own bonus versus large unit, with their own stat line, unit card, and battlefield role. TAC Marines with plasma weaponry, more armor piercing, more range damage output, but the potential for overheating or backfiring on the user. Now, given the insane amount of variety in weaponry many factions are able to field in 40k, this could lead to unit bloat super quick, where players are just completely overwhelmed by the amount of unit cards and similar sounding unit types for a faction. I mean, think about what we could end up with. TAC Marines with flamers, plasma rocket launchers or bolters, Assault Marines with chainswords, lightning claws, thunder hammers, Vanguard veterans, Stern Guard veterans, Devastators with heavy bolters, plasma cannons, las cannons, and heavy flamers, and then you get into the Primaris Marines with intercessors and aggressors and hellblasters and on and on and on, and I think you get the picture. CA has two choices here, and I'm curious which side of the fence you fall on. Do they strip it down to the bare essentials, maybe pick 2 or 3 different unit types and stick with those, where you go TAC Marines with bolters or TAC Marines with rocket launchers, and that's it. Those are the 2 unit variants for Tactical Marines. Or do you go for option 2, where you recruit a unit of Space Marines or Orc Boys or Eldari Guardians, and on its own separate tab, similar to the Lord skill trees we have in Total War Warhammer, you get to choose the weaponry and loadout and equipment they bring to the battlefield. So you recruit a unit of Space Marines, and they come as Assault, Tactical, or Devastator Squad. Then you open up a loadout panel that has equipment and upgrades. You select the specific loadout you want for that unit, with the Sergeant wielding a plasma pistol or Inferno weapon, which will then change the unit card. And as they rank up and gain experience, they can become a new unit. So Assault Marines, when sufficiently leveled, would become Vanguard Veterans. Veteran Tactical Marines would become Stern Guard Veterans, and so on, adding a sense of persistence and attachment to your units and to your armies. Now, there are benefits and downsides to each approach. For the first approach, keeping it the way it is now with Chosen Halberds, regular Chosen Great Weapons, it's a lot easier on the devs, I think. It keeps everything streamlined with clearly visible options right from the main menu. But especially in 40k, it can lead to pretty crazy roster bloat unless CA decides to cut down on the available options dramatically, in which case we're looking at less variety, less weaponry, and less content overall. On the flip side, with persistent customization and unit loadouts, there's a lot more work to be done here, which could negatively affect other aspects of the game. But it adds a ton more customization and personalization, and a more visually appealing user experience, but it takes more clicks overall to get what you want to get done, and will almost assuredly be the more complicated option. So, like I said, there are pros and cons to each. I think it's easy to say, oh yeah, I want option 2, because it's more content, right? We all love that stuff, but just be aware that could mean sacrifices made somewhere else on launch day. Something to keep in mind. But I've been yammering on for quite a while. It's time to let Italian jump in and discuss unit archetypes, how they would function, and new mechanics like stratagems that would make Total War Warhammer 40k special on the battlefield.
So now that we've talked about the battle maps, I think it's important to dive in on some of those battle mechanics that would be present on those maps, how those units might look or what they might feel like as far as their individual unit distinction. And I totally agree with Indie Pride here, right? This is going to be the biggest, baddest 40k game ever. And when you think about that, you've got to look at the Total War formula of the rock, paper, scissors that have always existed throughout the series. You have infantry, cavalry, and archers. And then siege engines or artillery, depending on which area you're taking a look at. And then their application in the rock, paper, scissors towards one another. It's a bit different in a 40k universe. You have a lot of different types of units. Even taking a look at Total War Warhammer, which introduces monstrous infantry into that equation, monstrous cavalry into that equation, you still have a lot of different variations taking a look at individual units in a 40k game. So real quick, let's kind of dive in on some of those. One of them would be definitely jump troops. Simply put, it's an infantry unit that could jump a certain distance and slam into the enemy if it's, say, a Space Marine Assault Squad unit. Or if you're thinking about orcs with the rockets attached to their back, they can just rocket into things. Or you look at the warp spiders of the Eldar who flop back and forth throughout the warp, moving further and further onto the battlefield. And we've seen this used awesomely in series like Dawn of War, right? Where you simply have a unit that's walking on foot, it's got its jump pack on its back, and you click a unit where you want it to charge attack, it'll rocket up into the air and slam down into them, sending units all over the place. That's exactly how I think a jump troop would work in a Total War 40k. Moving now into tanks and transports though, we get something that we've kind of already seen a little bit before. Tanks are something that we've already seen in Total War Warhammer. I think that a steam tank would operate very similarly to a Predator tank. Any of the Bane Blades, anything like that, just a larger scale, bigger, badder, scarier tanks. I think that tanks are a very easy thing to pull off. But what isn't is transports. But I still think it's a very, very easy thing to really kind of look at if I put a lens on it for you. So think of a Rhino transport tank in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, right? This is the troop carrier of the Space Marines, or the Chimera, the troop carrier of the Imperial Guard, able to mass transport troops down the battlefield. How would you really translate that though? So think of a siege tower anytime you play any other Total War for the most part. You jump into the game deployment, you can man the siege tower by units, you simply right click them, they are now manning that tower. The unit was killed off in the middle of the fight. Well, you just have another unit go and take over that tower. I see that same kind of UI, or at least UX, applicable to a transport. In the beginning portions of the battle, you select whatever units you want in those individual transports, and they're in that transport. They can then deploy from the transport throughout the fight. Let's say they want to get back in the transport and move further down the battlefield. Boom, they're done. They can right click into it and move right down the battlefield. I think that transport is something new to the Total War formula, but very easily achieved, because what is a siege tower other than just a slow moving transport covered in animal hides? So very easy, but a little bit takes a little bit of tweaking to kind of get your brain around, I think. Well, then we also have walkers, and this is a very broad term, right? You have varying functionality depending on the size and the type of unit. Dreadnoughts would function effectively like a Necrofex Colossus from Total War Warhammer, right? You've got this big hulking moving thing that shoots big shots from one arm and smacks you around with the other. But when you think about the larger walkers like Titans or Knights, envision a bound ability that you would use, then that you could then activate some of the more, I guess you could say, city destroying power of the larger walkers. When you look at Imperial Knights, like I was mentioning, some version of Titans, and hold on your thoughts about Titans. We've saved that for the very end of the video. I will jump into that a little bit more in detail, but you do have some larger scale walkers that you deal with, like in Riptides or Wraith Knights. So again, I think a lot of those guys would move very similar to Necrofix Colossi, but with having bound abilities that kind of adds a little more oomph to their larger size. Now, moving into bikes is a huge portion of Warhammer 40,000. You have your typical kind of bikes across your Chaos Space Marines, your Space Marines, but then when you take a look at stuff like Eldar and Dark Eldar, you get jet bikes, these kind of fast-moving things that hover above the ground. And obviously, I think that this would move or operate as a fast attack, almost chariot-esque unit, but there's less of a focus on riding things down like you do with a chariot, and more focus on range combat with these bikes. You could rapidly deploy some ability to use range combat with these bikes. Now, I obviously think that there should be some melee-centric bikes, but for the most part, I think bikes kind of are almost what we see currently in chariots. Now, another unit type, I guess you could call it, would be scouts and snipers. And I think that we see these in some way, shape, or form across all the Total Wars with the varying abilities to hide and shoot whilst hidden. But I think that the scouts and snipers need to have that same kind of layer added to them. I don't think there needs to be a very special system for them. I think they can just simply kind of have a stock and snipe ability like we get with Total War Warhammer. And I think the last unit worth really diving in on are Psykers. And this is the easiest one to talk about. It's literally just a mage from Total War Warhammer. It would have special abilities, and I think that's really it. Special disciplines, as they're called, psychic disciplines. But as we've stated earlier, now that we've talked about the units, there's another big portion of units and of the battlefields that is really important to not just Total War Warhammer 40k's proposed mechanics, but of the tabletop itself, and that is the stratagems. Stratagems are really the big driving force behind every single faction. When you take a look at fielding any faction in a tabletop game, you're looking at the stratagems to help give you that upper hand. And I think that stratagems are a really, really, really awesome way to add such cinematic color to any engagement you're getting involved in. If you look at some of the stratagems that exist in tabletop, the Blood Angels have one called Upon Wings of Fire, in which allows you to rapidly redeploy a jump pack unit to anywhere on the battlefield within 9 inches of the opponent. That's the tabletop rule. So if you were to envision this in a Total War game, picture my Dragon Princes charging into your right flank, and right at the last moment, I use this ability, and now they're on your left flank. So you have this ability to rapidly move things across the battlefield. Eldar have some really awesome ones as well. They've got Fire and Fade, in which case they're shooting their guns and they just fade away and just right to the back or right into the backfield of safety. They can summon a Seer Council from the warp. They can use Link Fire with their Fire Prism tanks to really allow their Fire Prisms to connect all their shots for one big overcharge shot to destroy a Titan. You get these really climactic cinematic moments, like something you'd almost see out of Lord of the Rings, where you've got, Gimli's swinging down doing this, Legolas is doing that, and ultimately they kill a troll. It's the same kind of thing here, where these stratagems give you that extra punch and a great way to really color your engagements, like I said. Like, picture this one here. Abaddon the Despoiler can deep strike his special units of Terminators called the Bringers of Despair into an opponent's backline. That's like watching a cinematic come to life in an actual game without it going, this is not the cinematic, this is actual game engine. So you have your whole front, you have your whole backline firing down my Chaos Cultists. You're really getting the upper hand. You destroyed 2 of my Predators. All of a sudden, boom, you have the Bringers of Despair. These massive, hulking, what's called Tactical Dreadnought armor, Terminator armor, is now beating down towards you to destroy your backline of Imperial Guardsmen as Abaddon the Despoiler cackles off in the distance, knowing that this is what's going to happen. So you really get these really game-breaking abilities, and that's really the crux of the stratagems as a whole. Is the way to take the Total War rule, or I'm sorry, the tabletop rules, and break them. You pay for it because you have to use what's called a command point, which we'll get into in just a second. But I think this awesome ability to kind of say, hey, here's the established rules of the game, and here's how you get to break them with your special rules for your army. And so talking about command points, because that is important to these stratagems, I think the command points can dictate a lot of the flow of not just the battle, but how stratagems are used. So typically, there's very rare do you have any stratagems that cost more than 3 command points, or CP, which I will now use for the remainder of this video. So I think that per cost of your stratagem, 1, 2, or 3, is 30 seconds. So if you have a 1 cost stratagem, then it takes 30 seconds for it to come online as soon as the battle starts. So they immediately start on recycle. If you have a 3 CP stratagem, it takes 90 seconds. So yeah, maybe you can have your heavy bolter devastator squad shoot special hellfire rounds. It's going to cost 1 CP. It takes 30 seconds for it to turn on. Or I can bring down an orbital strike from orbit. How orbital strike works, but it costs 3 CP, and it's going to take 90 seconds for you to do a devastating amount of damage to my army. So I think CP needs to be kind of balanced, because obviously if we're talking about the ability to break the game's rules, it has to have a system within it. So I think what would be interesting is the way this is done in tabletop is your CP is generated by how your army is constructed across its I guess you could call them their battalions, or the vanguard deployments, all these individual constructions of your army list. That's not going to be as prevalent here because it's too micro, it's too intensive, and that's something that I think Indy and I have really talked a lot about. Is a lot of the more intensive tabletop rules, which work in a pen and paper scenario, don't work for the streamlined setting of a video game. So CP, I look at it this way: both sides. Okay, if my 2 armies meet, both sides have 5 CP as just a blanket number. You always have 5, but factors can contribute or reduce from that CP pool based off of campaign mechanics. Maybe, okay, I'm under siege, so does that mean I gain or I lose 1, depending on what scenario? Am I the defender or am I the attacker? Maybe I have a special skill that allows me to get 1 more CP if I'm attacking a unit not under siege. Okay, because I'm great at assaulting things, or I'm great at harrying units because I'm the Dark Eldar, so I'm good at ambushing. That gives me 1 more CP. So now I've got 6 rather than 5. Oh, you know what? You were in the equivalent of, let's just say, March stance, so that's -1 to your CP always. So now it's 4 to 6. So I think the CP can be a very interesting way to coordinate your attacks in a very fun manner. That it's not just simply, okay, I'm going to right click and we're going to duke it out here. This is the way this is going to be. CP kind of, it forces you to get in these engagements that's going to give you the most advantage for your CP and the biggest disadvantage for your opponent's CP. And that's what I think would be the most fun about stratagems and their execution, because I think the way that you could even envision it in the battlefield itself is that when you think about when you press the space bar, you have that little menu that pops up on the right side, and you can tweak certain things in the game. Like, okay, I want my unit markers to be visible. I want terrain. I want forest to be invisible. Well, I would think of something similar to that for CP and stratagem execution. Your stratagems are a bunch of grayed out little circles on the right side of the field that you can access by holding a button to take a look at them and reveal them. That way they're not constantly obstructing your view. Or if they're grayed out if you don't have enough CP, or so on and so forth. So it's a little bit of an easier UX when it comes to taking advantage of all those many awesome ways you can take advantage of your specific army's special abilities. But now that we've talked a little bit about the actual mechanics of the battlefield, there's one important portion of battlefields, and I think of total war games, that we all really want to look at, and that's how sieges would work. And it would be something that's just so much different than the scale that we're used to. It would be a much grander than the current system of smaller style, single layer defenses. I mean, you would have a larger wall that is a bit more insurmountable, and a larger battlefield before it, encouraging sorties or deep strikes or teleport attacks, orbital bombardment stratagems, just a lot more layers to this. The big challenge, though, is finding a middle ground so that each siege doesn't feel like a slog from wall to front line. This can be achieved by making capturable objective points, or something that at least adds to the flow of the battle and doesn't encourage being stationary on the field. I mean, when you look exclusively at Warhammer 40,000's sieging mechanics, it's typically these overwhelming numbers tossed at these impossibly high walls with shield generators and gigantic wall emplacements, essentially like Think of medieval sieges, but on a much grander scale, of course. So the blueprint for a siege is really already present when you look at Total War Medieval 2 or Rome 2. But with Warhammer 40k, you're dealing with hive cities or fortresses that are far too large or vast to be surrounded like you can in those games. So I think the proper way to execute this would be looking at just an isolated or critical point in defenses, either the gate or just a random point along the wall. Something that can be sort of micro-focused for the intent of the game, with the defending side dominating an entire portion of the map. Basically think Warhammer, or Total War Warhammer sieges, but better. And let's go into what better means. So for one, let's talk about the attrition and surrender system. And also, I guess that could be linked up to CP and planetary stratagems, however you want to kind of look at that. But, and Indy is going to go into naval battles in just a second here, but I think that planetary naval elements are a big portion of sieges. And how this can really work is, rather than it being attrition and a surrender system like we currently get with Total War, I think that the longer the siege goes, the more CP you gain as the attacker, because you're destroying more of the planetary naval elements. And you're going to be able to reinforce with, I don't know, drop pods, orbital bombardments, much in the same way I guess you could say you do with battering rams or siege towers. And basically, the longer you siege, the more CP you're going to generate and the more CP you're going to negate from your opponent. And obviously the opponent can have certain buildings in their province, or I'm sorry, I guess in their planetary capital, I guess you want to call it, that could lower this rate or increase the amount of time it would take for this to actually kick in. But when we take a look at the actual siege itself, I think we have to look at sieges in Warhammer 40k and how infrequent they are. I mean, Terra, Cadia, Ophelia 7, Baal, Macragge, Armageddon. These are all these pivotal, huge, awesome planets, right? Well, there's galaxies filled with planets in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. So there's not going to be a siege at every single system you go to. And in fact, Indy and I both agree that is one of the biggest problems with the Total War formula as is. There's too many siege battles and not enough land battles. And the siege battles, they don't really have any stakes to them. Like, yeah, okay, you're fighting this walled minor settlement, and it's going to cost your troops it's going to cost your army some troops to take it out. But I think at the end of the day, it's just kind of a slog for you. So we both agree that sieges have to be these amazing multi-stage scenarios where if you are sieging a planet, you know you're going to be capturing something that's really worth it for you as the besieger and really worth it for you as the defender to hold on to or to take. So I think that is really got to be the crux of the siege of Total War 40k. It's got to be less prevalent and more multi-tiered and more intensive and more like, oh man, I got to shut the game off because that was so intense. And when I say multi-stage, a lot of the sieges in Warhammer 40k take place on the landing field, right? Okay, now I'm going to land all of my drop pods, land all of my Thunderhawks to deploy all of my siege batteries, all of my Basilisk artillery platforms, all of my Eldar D cannons, everything that I'm going to be doing. I'm going to basically have a landing zone first, a drop zone first. And I think that has to be a smaller scale fight. And if we're just kind of thinking the armies themselves, just to kind of use blanket numbers, this is no relevance to anything, but I'm talking about, okay, everything in that first fight right there has got to be 10 units on 10 units. Or maybe the defender gets 20 and the attacker gets 10, because you're landing things piecemeal, whatever it really is. So essentially, you have this point where you as the defending faction can try to get the upper hand by smashing them out of their landing or their actual initial deployment zone. And then once you win or lose that, it will then confer bonuses or penalties to you as the attacker or the defender in the actual wall defense. The wall defense itself we'll go into in just a little bit there. But then the wall defense can maybe just be, let's just say 20 units on 20 units. And then as it pushes into, that deep kind of inner city fight, that last stand, the keep, holding the keep, the inner keep fight, that's kind of a king of the hill style. Okay, now the attacker gets 20 and you as the defender get 10. Maybe something like that, and maybe those are too skewed of numbers and pushes you into too off of a back foot to start on, depending on which one you are with the 10. But I'm just saying, as far as like having units to take advantage of, it would give you some sort of stakes to each stage of these sieges, and I think makes for a lot more fun and kind of clears up the monotony that you get fighting these random little sieges on these minor provinces, places that really don't really mean much to you. I think that every siege has to be pivotal to your campaign and to the direction of your campaign. So let's focus on the siege itself, because the vast scale of this universe, it's far easier to infiltrate one Tyranid Lictor or a surgical deployment of Eldar, Space Marines, so on and so forth. I mean, even looking at Chaos, it would make sense if you could somehow prep your siege by creating a cult in a hive city that revolts at the time of the siege. So that leads me into my assumption that the siege would be, again, like I said earlier, multi-layered and multi-stage. Not like a birthday cake that says, "Happy birthday, Indie Pride, love Italian Spartacus." No, something far more erotic. I mean along the lines of being able to just deploy specialist units, cultists, demons, whatever it is, behind the defender's lines. And now we're not talking about necessarily a secondary army here, just 1, 2, 3, 4 units that creates another, I guess you could say, mini game, or it ups the stakes for you to attempt to hinder the defenses of the enemy. And that's what I meant earlier. Is like the defender has to have a reason to take the walls, and the attacker has to have a reason to hold the walls. When you play a current Total War game, why even hold the walls? Especially Total War Warhammer. There's no reason to hold the walls. Use the walls as basically a choke point to kill them, and then push back to your center area and hold that too, because it's filled with choke points. So I think that in Total War 40k, depending on the level of the planetary defense of the system, or however it would be idealized, it would be great if each siege had 1 or 2 primary systems, I'll call them, that the defender needs to guard, like a shield generator that maybe infers like a 33% missile resistance to everyone on the walls, or wall turrets that can fire in a 360 radius. So if you lose the wall turrets, then the attacker can now fire on you, the defender. So think about that. If you actually had strategic points to hold that truthfully meant something to the integrity of the siege, you would do it, right? And especially if they gave you a bonus, like shield generators reducing your overall missile resistance damage. Or like I said, wall turrets now are going to fire on your city rather than firing out to defend the city. Maybe a communications array, if a third one fits, that could maybe help out with orbital bombardments or bombardments down from a defense platform that would be in orbit. These systems would be the objectives for any infiltrating elements of the attacking force to vastly speed up the siege as well. So those aforementioned cultists, those aforementioned lictors, they could try and take these points to help you out. And I envision this in one of 2 ways. You could do it where the attacker and the defender kind of square off in a smaller scale battle. I think that might be a little too cumbersome if we're already talking about multi-stage fights. So let's throw that one out the window. The latter idea would have the critical points be in the defender's deployment zone, and that the infiltrators can move their way towards, and the defender then has to decide how many units he wants to commit to the internal defense. That feels a bit more interesting and also more stressful for both sides. And you have to remember, this isn't just going to be, okay, I've got a wall, and I've got a city, and I've got an open field in front of me. I feel like it's got to have way more than that. There's these discussions, or I'm sorry, there's the depiction in the Black Library books that the sieges have usually trench systems in front of the battlements, and then even individual bunkers amongst the trench systems. And at the same time, the attackers have the same thing in response. And the walls are so high up and so multi-tiered themselves with, okay, there's the high platforms at the top of the walls, and there's the reinforcing platforms to move behind the walls. You have this kind of multi-layered system that I think really can be utilized and taken advantage of, rather than simply, okay, I've got the battlefield, the wall, the city. I think it's got to be way more than that. The battlefield out front of the wall has got what would be essentially a moat in trenches, and then the wall itself has got 2 levels to it. And then the wall itself is so high up that it can't fully defend the city below. So if you breach the walls, either by planting charges to blow it up, you use any of your jump troops to mount up onto it, if you use any kind of flying units to get across the walls, any way you can to really get over those walls, even using the equivalent of a Warhammer 40,000 ladder to scale them. Once you get into the city, you're pretty much protected from the walls as long as you are dealing with the walls at the same time. You still have the defense batteries that can shoot down into the city and destroy you, so you have to really kind of take that into consideration, because obviously a defense battery is going to have way more sight than just a simple soldier on a wall. So I think that the layers of the siege and the stages are what really is going to depart the Total War 40,000 proposed system that Indy and I are looking at for sieges than the typical kind of formula. But I know what you're probably thinking. What about all the many different ways you can deploy on a planet outside of just landing an army and attacking it? Well, that's our next section, special deployment. And Warhammer 40,000 is known for having amazingly sweeping surgical strikes or lightning attacks at a minute's notice. I mean, the Codex Astartes calls these tactics Steel Rain. Okay, that was a really bad call out to Dawn of War, but on a serious note, some factions rely entirely on their usage of these tactics to prosecute war on the opponent. The drop pods, deep strikes, and teleport attacks of the Space Marines to the sudden webway portals of the Eldar. There's always some methodology for appearing unannounced in the enemy's front yard and demanding their rent money. But how would this be done in a Total War 40k game? Would it be too imbalanced if you could just summon a unit of demons or Terminators out of the blue? The short answer, yes. I think that there has to be a balance built into the system that uses something to either penalize or prevent the use of such tactics. This could easily be achieved by having any kind of special deployment unit, having it as part of their unit card, much in the same way as Siege Attackers or Vanguard is built into Total War Warhammer units. You don't have to Vanguard, but you can. So in the pre-battle or pre-siege selection screen, it would make a lot of sense if you could just simply nominate which units are deep striking, as it is called. And even then, maybe you are only limited to 3 or 4 units, so you aren't abusing the system. Perhaps some legendary lords, or I guess their equivalent, could enable for a higher number of these units. It's executed the same way in tabletop. If you have deep striking units, you may deep strike them. It's not an absolute requirement. But I think that this is a great way to kind of pay homage to that tactic without it being over the top or easily exploitable. Even further, you could put a 60-second timer on the ability to summon those units from reserve. They aren't available the second a battle starts, much like we talked about with the Stratagems. If we're looking at the functionality of these abilities, they're used as armies are charging towards one another. So it would be done in the first initial movements of each army. The 60-second time allows for forces to feel each other out or get in better locations before kind of pushing the initiative with deep strikes and other abilities. I don't think there really needs to be a lot more said there because we don't really know how that system would even be incorporated. Another big system, though, I think a lot of people are going to be asking about are naval battles. I'm going to toss it back over to Indy Pride here, and he can help us out with our opinion on how naval battles would make it into a Total War 40k.
So I am 100% with you guys that void battles and space combat are incredibly important elements of Warhammer 40k. There's no getting around that fact. After all, this all takes place across the vast expanse of the Milky Way galaxy. It's how armies get from planet to planet, system to system. And so just by its very nature, space will play a larger role than the ocean ever has in any historical Total War, or even in Mortal Empires. With that said, 40k is a gigantic undertaking, as we've said many times before. That much is obvious, and we've seen Creative Assembly's outlook on naval combat in fantasy, in Total War Troy, and in Three Kingdoms as well. That should answer any questions you have right off the bat. If they're not going to make wooden ships in a game with functionally one race, you can rest assured they will not be tackling the insane variety and massive rosters of 40k fleets. You're talking about 15 wildly different factions from the word go. Because as we know, there's enough content there to make a game unto itself. In fact, it's already been done with Battlefleet Gothic Armada. There's some undeniable overlap and conflict of interest there. Some cannibalization Games Workshop probably would not love to partake in, all other issues aside. And there are plenty of other issues. So the sheer size and scope of building this universe and nailing the land combat, what will be the most ambitious project for CA ever, already precludes true void warfare, at least on launch day, and probably for many years after, if it ever happens at all, and I think there's a good chance it wouldn't. But there is still a way to make it happen, to make void warfare, to make ship battles happen, to reach a middle ground that's still satisfying and a much better alternative than auto-resolving anytime two fleets bump uglies in space, and the blueprint is already there in the underways and island battles of Warhammer 2. One of the crazy things about ship-to-ship combat in 40k is that they're all bigger than your mother, which is saying a lot, I know, but these are titanic floating planets, Death Stars capable of holding hundreds of thousands or millions of tech adepts and battle-hardened warriors. Craft worlds are home to billions of Eldar. Gloriana-class battleships have hangar bays that could swallow 50 football fields without breaking a sweat. So, when we're talking the scale of a Total War battle, you could easily fit 8 full armies in the causeways and ramparts of these fortresses without any issues whatsoever. These could be handled just like underway battles in Total War Warhammer 2. Couple maps for each race, built in a long, thin corridor with opposing forces duking it out in the hangar bays of a capital ship. Now yes, that's not exactly how races in 40k handle boarding actions all the time. In the lore, Space Marines would use Kestis assault rams to bulldoze their way into a ship wherever they can, wherever's most convenient, fighting deck to deck in squads to disable objectives or eliminate the bridge. That element doesn't work very well in Total War, but having armies square off in a huge Gothic atrium on board a massive Gloriana-class battleship or something certainly would. There's also the route that island battles took in Mortal Empires, having fleets meet at a nearby planet to resolve their differences the old-fashioned way in a pure land battle. And while not a perfect system by any stretch of the imagination, again, it is vastly preferable to relying on auto-resolve as you cross the void. So, my opinion, Italian's opinion, naval battles in and of themselves aren't going to be happening. We're not going to be seeing true ship-to-ship combat, but you can still get that same feel and still get the enjoyment of fighting the battles without all the problems that would come with auto-resolve only, and there's a reason CA decided to address that issue. It wasn't working out very well, so they added island battles. Same thing could be done here from the word go.
So yeah, I mean, we just talked about some naval battles. You guys get an idea for where we stand on that. And again, it's kind of the same way with Titans. When you look at Titans, especially like Imperator Titans, these rarely seen, humongous, moving cities that are just many meters large, right? Like they're just impossibly huge. I mean, they wreck hive cities with one blast of their cannons. So I think that scale needs to kind of come down. So do we think that Titans could be in the game? Yes, Warhound Titans, but I don't think that an Imperator Titan has any place in a Total War battlefield. I think the only time it would make sense for it to be there is if, okay, you have Terra as one of your locations. It automatically gets a special Imperator Titan unit, or maybe it has an Imperator Titan bound ability as part of the siege of attacking it. I think it's too impossibly large for it to make much sense on the battlefield, and its abilities are just kind of like so out of proportion for the scale we're talking about. But I think Tau Riptides, Wraith Knights, again, Warhounds, Armigers, Imperial Knights, they more fit the scale of Total War battlefields and could work with the mass deployments that we would be talking about on a scale for a Total War Warhammer 40,000. But in conclusion, I think it's kind of worth mentioning that my thoughts on this are that I think that this is a very easily attainable game for a Total War franchise if Total War is willing to really change its formula, change its engine, do a whole lot of things that could take a long time for it to come to fruition. I think that the battle map in specific is going to be the hardest thing to tackle. I think the campaign map will be very self-explanatory once you kind of work out some kinks on it and so on and so forth. And we'll talk about more, I guess, those individual capital systems or whatever we're talking about that would lend to a big, massive siege. But I think for the most part, once you kind of tweak how you really perceive Total War and how you kind of look at Warhammer 40,000 scale and how it would be kind of truncated down to a Total War game, I think it's just as easily achievable and seemingly impossible as Total War Empire was. No one ever thought that would ever fit into a Total War formula, and lo and behold, here it is. Same thing with Total War Warhammer. The big, kind of auspice was like, this is a history series, why are we jumping into fantasy? And it's worked out amazingly. Like Total War, Warhammer 1 and 2 are amazing games. I cannot wait to see what we get with Warhammer 3. If Warhammer 40,000 is a game that is on the horizon, I know that somehow Creative Assembly will make it work in their systems or in their formulas by tweaking and changing the things that need to be changed.
And I'll throw in a caveat there. I heard the word easy a lot. There's nothing easy about it, which Italian and I both agree on. It's going to be a damn difficult behemoth to put together. There's no question about that. But just because it isn't easy, just because it will require complete overhauls and new features and mechanics, doesn't mean it isn't doable, or that the product that comes out the other end won't be Total War. The next logical step after Warhammer Fantasy, the cash cow, the money fight, the red panty night, is Total War Warhammer 40k, using the same successful blueprint they've already used to make the Mortal Empires trilogy, to sell Total War Warhammer 1, Warhammer 2, and what will soon be announced, Warhammer 3. It's a blueprint for printing money in terms of DLC, in terms of additional content, in terms of selling a united trilogy that combines into one grand campaign. It's the smart move for Games Workshop in the wake of Dawn of War's epic crash and burn. It's a smart move for Creative Assembly in, printing some moolah. And it is already clear that this union has borne juicier fruit than any of us could have ever possibly imagined. Strap in, ladies and gentlemen. We're going for a wild ride. And for the next part, myself and Italian will be talking campaign map, sectors, systems, and the wider Milky Way galaxy. Guard your soul. See you in the cosmos.